Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Welcome back, listeners, to the Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. As we talk about regularly, Wyoming is an energy producing state. We produce more energy per capita than any other state, and it's not even close. We produce energy that others across the nation use in various forms. That includes coal, oil, gas, uranium, electricity, and more. So today we're focused on the electric sector. Wyoming consumes about 40% of the electricity produced in the state, and that means we export about 60%, according to Energy Information Administration. Because we are exporting so much of our electricity, what happens in markets outside the state of Wyoming is really important to us. So today we have an expert in energy markets and electricity markets with an extensive background in this area. So welcome, Mr. Todd Snitchler. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Holly.
Welcome to Laramie.
Glad to be here.
We're so glad to have you as part of our podcast. So let's start with your background. Tell our listeners a little bit about your background.
Sure. I always tell people that I'm three things. I'm a recovering legislator, I'm a recovering regulator, and I'm a recovering lawyer. But I run the Electric Power Supply Association now. So we're a trade association that represents competitive power generators. Prior to that, I worked for the American Petroleum Institute, where I represented the market development portfolio or the natural gas portfolio of their business. Before that, I did some lobbying and consulting work in Columbus. Before that, I was the chair of the Ohio Public Utilities Commission and the Ohio Power Siting Board for a number of years under Governor John Kasich at the time. Prior to that, I was elected member of the Ohio General Assembly, elected to 2 terms to represent the 50th House District in the General Assembly, which was parts of Northeast Ohio. And then before that, I'm a lawyer by training. And so I had a practice where I represented small businesses and did business practice. So
Great.
That's kind of the short version.
Okay, well, that's a lot to unpack there. Yeah. So let's start with the Ohio legislature. So sure. Why did you run, and were there any issues in particular that you focused on during your time in the legislature? Yeah,
I always knew I was going to run for elected office. I wanted to do it. I knew I was interested in doing it. Ohio has term limits. And so where we lived in Northeast Ohio, my predecessor was term limited. And so that gave me the opportunity to run for the office. And so I had a great group of friends that I met through a leadership program that we all participated in who said, somebody should do something. So you're the guy. You're going to run for office. So I said, okay, let's do it. So we had a contested primary and ran, and then won in the general, and then was reelected 2 years later. So while I was in the General Assembly, we were in the minority for my first term, and then we took the majority for our second term. So I was a member of the Public Utilities Committee. When I was in the minority, I chaired the Public Utilities Committee briefly while I was in the majority before I went to the Public Utilities Commission. I had written a paper and had it published when I was in law school on utility deregulation in Ohio. So I kind of came by my utility experience naturally. And so the speaker said, I think it'd be useful to put you in a committee where you already have some interest. And so I really got educated a bit more as both a committee member and then as chair of the committee. And then, of course, when you go to the commission, you really get the education you thought you had. You really get it in spades when you're at the commission.
So how did that opportunity present itself to get on the commission?
Yeah, great question. My predecessor there left. He had been the chair for, I think, 10 or 11 years. And when a new governor was elected, he said the governor should be able to pick the person he wants to be his or her chair. So I'm going to step down and let Governor Kasich pick the person he wants to be it. Ohio has a nomination process where you go through and a nominating council interviews candidates, and then they make a recommendation of 4 potential candidates to the governor. The governor then can pick any one of the 4, or the governor can reject and ask for 4 more. Obviously, I went through the process and was on the short list and then was selected by the governor to be the chair of the commission. So that's kind of how it worked.
And let's not take for granted, not everyone knows what every Public Utilities Commission does.
Sure.
So let's start there. So what are the responsibilities of the PUC in Ohio?
Yeah, the commission in Ohio has 5 main areas that you regulate. It's electricity and natural gas. Those are the 2 big ones that everyone usually is aware of, but also water, telecom, and transportation. Those were smaller and not smaller in importance, but they just didn't occupy as much of the time in the caseload, the matters that came before the commission. Transportation was really truck safety and then rail safety and crossing, those kind of issues. So important to the lives of 11.5 million Ohioans, but doesn't affect your back pocket the way the utility gas and electric cases did.
Right.
And those are the ones that were always in the paper. Then nobody ever wrote you were awarded $1 million for a train crossing upgrade, didn't make the paper. But when your utility bill is going to go up by 8%, it was above the fold in the paper across the state. So it was the work that was kind of done behind the scenes that people didn't pay attention to, but really does affect the lives of your constituents every day. And, as it was explained to me when I interviewed and when I took the role was, you're probably the highest non-elected official in the state because the decisions you make affect literally every single business and family in the state of Ohio. So it's a pretty weighty responsibility.
It is. So what did you like about being a utility regulator?
I enjoyed the work. I enjoyed the people. You get to meet folks around the country that are similarly situated. I was told this is where your political career goes to die. Like nobody takes this role for their next political job, and that was fine. That wasn't why I took it in the first place. The opportunity to kind of help shape energy policy, given my background and the work that I had done in looking at how competition can actually benefit consumers, how you can deliver reliability, was something I was interested in anyway. Governor Kasich was also very interested in how do we make sure that consumers benefit from what we're doing in the state, because at the end of the day, that's politically, it's a smart thing to do, but it's also beneficial for business development. It's beneficial for stopping the brain drain, all the kids that were leaving the state. Right. If you make it attractive in any number of ways, not least of which is pocketbook issues, that's important. So this afforded me the opportunity to do that and work with commissioners that, of course, run a rolling cycle. There's 5 commissioners in Ohio, and you're appointed one every year is basically up for their 5-year appointment. So I rotated through probably 7 or 8 different commissioners while I was there. But you get an opportunity to work with people that take different political backgrounds. They come from different skill sets, and they have different perspectives. And in the end, how do we try to arrive at an outcome that's good for consumers, that ensures that the utilities are healthy, consumers have reliable and affordable power, and we're in a position where Ohio is attractive as a place to both raise your family but invest in businesses. And that's pretty significant. So it was a lot of fun to work on that. It wasn't without its challenges, but those were kind of the things that you try to look at the horizon and say, this is why you took the role. This is why I wanted to be here.
And then after you left, you said you went to American Petroleum Institute, it's different, not focused on the electricity sector.
Yep.
So talk about the difference and why you chose to go to API and what you took from that experience.
Yeah, API was very focused on the electric sector because natural gas was becoming an ever more important part of the electric system. Mm-hmm. So still about where can the markets be developed to sell gas? So whether it's LNG exports or it was greater utilization at utility level or really the power sector, because I came with some of that background and had worked with a lot of independent power producers that were using gas and were building more gas plants, it was kind of a natural fit for me.
So you were focused on the electricity sector?
Not exclusively, but a significant amount of our time was invested in that because how do we enable people that want to consume your product the opportunity to both get it, whether it was through the pipes or we need to have the supply, or frankly, a lot of the development was in the Utica and Marcellus Shale where gas was incredibly inexpensive, and it's the equivalent of Wyoming's mine mouth coal, where you build your power plant right on top of the gas field and there's almost no transportation and delivery. You get it at very low cost, which means you're very efficient. And in a restructured market like Pennsylvania and Ohio, that means you're called to run and you get paid. So it was a good marriage of both experience and what the market opportunities were.
The other thing that is a really important intersection between the oil and gas industry and electricity industry is simply the impact of power costs on production.
Correct.
And that's something that is more regional, but certainly something we're looking at here in Wyoming.
Yeah, as you see the change from gas-powered equipment to more electrified equipment, that becomes a real issue. Then it's also how do we get the power to where it is?
Sure, yeah.
And if you look at West Texas and the Permian, their energy demand is through the roof, and it's how quickly can we move the electrons from where they're being produced to where these folks want to utilize them. So it's an exciting time to be in the industry, but it's a challenging time because there's so much happening all at once.
It is. And if you look at the rural West that doesn't have the kind of very populated development that you see like in the Permian, how do you even get electricity to some of those producers? It's a big challenge we have.
Yes.
We're looking at all kinds of stuff. So, okay, so now you're at the Electric Power Supply Association. You've been there for more than 5 years. So talk about, can I shorten to EPSA? Is that
sure? Okay. Please do. That's what we call it.
Okay, EPSA. So what does EPSA do?
Yeah, we're the national trade association that represents competitive power suppliers and generators, and we advocate in principally Washington. So we're DC focused in that we work at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. We do engagement on the Hill, and we deal with the administrative agencies, of course, on issues that support a competitive power sector, a healthy competitive market for competitive generators to be able to provide power in restructured markets around the country. Wholesale power markets are not in all 50 states. They are in 14 states and maybe a couple, the District of Columbia and a couple other spots. So well-functioning wholesale power markets are how our members operate and are able to engage in their business and profit or not based on their performance. And so our objective is to try to make sure that those markets are functional, that they're workable, and that it gives a fair opportunity for our members to compete. Because people say, well, how does that work? I mean, you have members that own assets and like they all sit around the table and like, well, yeah, they do. They're competitors, but they're also our sector of the energy industry. There's really four legs to the stool. There's competitive power suppliers, that's my members. There's vertically integrated utilities, so that's the EEI member companies, the Southern Company or Duke or folks like that. Then there's public power, which are the municipals, and then there's the rural electric co-ops. So those four legs to the stool are kind of the four different ways that Americans get their power across the country.
It's very complicated if you're not in this sector.
100%. So. It's complicated even if you are in the sector.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it seems like some of the issues that are facing electricity markets, they're also very complicated and they've changed over time. Mm-hmm. We're hearing more about reliability concerns generally these days across the nation. So how has EPSA kind of changed its focus or added that emphasis during the time when there's more discussions around reliability?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've actually, for the last 2 years, worked really hard to try and raise this issue to be of principal importance, because I think policymakers started to take reliability for granted, really to members of Congress, in some ways to the various administrative agencies that are writing the rules, that are trying to define how we're going to power the system going forward, and to the federal energy regulators. Like, at the end of the day, we want to ensure a reliable system. We have a different motive maybe than some of our utility cousins who have captive customers and they have guaranteed rates of recovery. If we're not reliable and we don't perform, we don't get paid. And if we don't perform, we are subject to performance penalties. And that can bankrupt a company or an asset where they end up having to just let it go and the bank takes it over and the next buyer tries to operate it in a way that is competitive and allows them to profit from it. So as we look at reliability, it's fundamentally important from a business perspective. But at the end of the day, it's also, what I always tell people, Americans want three things: lights on, beer cold, water warm. Mm-hmm. And reliability is what delivers those three things. So how we help the system achieve those objectives, I think, is fundamentally important. As you noted, there's been a significant change over the last several years where we see different pressures on reliability. For a while, we had excessive reserve margins, and I don't mean that to sound in a pejorative way, but there was plenty of headroom in the event that a plant went offline. There was another plant that could come in and make sure that the system remained reliable.
Let's dig in a little more to what you mean in terms of reliability and having what you called headspace. So there's a regional market, and it's made up of lots of different power plants, all serving customers, and customers are demands going up and down, and the plants some of them are running full out, some of them are flexing to try to make sure that demand is met. And so there was always extra in the system. So maybe a power plant particularly, so these would be our dispatchable plants, like most likely coal and gas, could operate, let's say one could operate at 500 megawatts. That's how much they can put out. Mm-hmm. But they didn't, right? They stopped short of that somewhere, 400 or 450. And they held that 50 megawatts in case somebody else faltered and in case something else happened, demand spiked. And so what built-in margin was there? Is there like a percentage you can point to that's kind of a general number?
Yeah, every market has a different reserve margin that's required. So you used a correct but a little more sophisticated example. I try and make it a little less sophisticated, a little more simple because I'm not great at math. So if your maximum demand is 100,000 megawatts, because you could end up losing some generation along the way, a unit goes offline or a line drops, they'd procure 115,000 megawatts because that reserve margin, that extra 15,000 megawatts, would ensure that the system would operate reliably in the event of an outage. So you have your largest plant go offline or your largest transmission line drops, but you've got to move power where it needs to be. That reserve margin is what helps ensure that reliability exists. So you never procure just enough. It's always what your peak demand is plus some reserve margin. It's usually 15 to 20% is a pretty good barometer for what they would like people to procure. Some markets had much higher reserve margins because people had made investments and there were assets that were available but maybe weren't running because they weren't necessary, but when they were needed, it was critically important. Well, because of retirements due to environmental rules or due to economics and changing circumstances, some of those plants have gone away, so that excess reserve is now much closer to the target reserve margin, which means that your supply-demand curve gets more steep, which means prices are likely to go up unless we add new generating resources to the system. That is not getting any easier. It's getting more difficult in virtually every part of the country, whether you're a restructured market or you're vertically integrated. The permitting and siting process, the supply chain issues, workforce, all of those things are having an impact on how quickly you can get sufficient resources put back into the stack that will then be needed to power the system. So that's a reliability concern that we're paying really close attention to.
That's a really good point. I mean, we're seeing it across the board. It really doesn't matter what kind of energy you're working on. Just getting big infrastructure built is incredibly challenging for so many different reasons. So a 15 or 20% reserve margin, it sounds like a lot, but is that because it's so catastrophic if you don't have enough? I mean,
yes. I mean, the outcome if you lose power or if you have a blackout or a rolling brownout, depending on the time of year, if it's the winter, I mean, it's the difference between someone freezing and somebody being able to heat their home. In the summer, it's no air conditioning when it's 100 degrees out for days on end. So those are life and death situations. And some people like to say, oh, you're catastrophizing or you're trying to make it sound worse than it is and you're kind of talking your book. And at the end of the day, I don't think that's the case. I think ultimately no one wants to go through another Winter Storm Uri or a Winter Storm Elliott because the outcomes are potentially very, very bad. And we're trying to make sure that we meet our obligations to deliver. The utilities that move electrons across the wires are trying to meet their obligations to deliver the power to the people that need it. And if this is the way you have to build the system, then that's what we should be doing. And the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, they're the reliability organization. They have been flashing warning signals now for at least 5 years in their annual long-term reliability assessments and in their summer and winter reliability assessments to say, we have an emerging problem that we've got to pay attention to because dispatchable resources are leaving the system too quickly. We're not adding sufficient dispatchable or not intermittent resources fast enough to replace them. Their performance characteristics are different. Inverter-based resources don't operate in a way that dispatchable, traditional, heavy equipment operates. And so we're trying to replicate that performance in a way that is out of kilter, both in volume and the way that the technology works. We can get there, but I think the timelines are in question. And I know NERC has been saying pretty urgently, policymakers, you need to be paying attention to this because the aspirational goals of the policies are admirable, but the operational realities of the system are the difference between lights on and lights off.
Say what you mean by inverter-based resources.
It's the technology that's used for intermittent resources like wind and solar to integrate them into the system. And the way those inverters work, and I'm no engineer, so this is the layman's explanation.
I just wanted the wind and solar part because not everyone necessarily associates that term. So it sounds like there's your group, NERC, a few different groups are trying to kind of raise the alarm about reliability. And at the same time, there are new federal rules you mentioned related to the power sector. So has it been hard to get attention to this topic, or do you feel like the rules are consistent with reliability concerns?
We have raised in our comments, and in future comments, we will reiterate the fact that we think that the proposed rule and the existing rule are out of kilter with the reliability expectations and frankly where the system is today. We have made clear to EPA that our members are invested in carbon capture. We think that that is a viable future technology. We're trying to get there from here, but as of today, it is not commercially viable in 1,000 power plants across the country. The infrastructure that's needed to both capture, transport, and store the carbon once it's emitted as part of the combustion process doesn't exist. Not every part of the country has the geology that will allow you to store it. So if you don't have a pipe to move it to a place where you can store it, that's a problem. I think Ernie Moniz's group did an analysis that said we're going to need 50,000 miles of carbon pipelines that you can't utilize the existing infrastructure. You need new pipes to do it in order to capture the carbon that will be necessary. And he's no right of center, person that's trying to keep fossil fuel plants on. He's trying to take, a center-left approach to say this is what's required to achieve the policy objectives. That's not being countenanced, I don't think, by the people writing the rules. And that's problematic because we have to be fact-based. We can't be aspirational-based because at the end of the day, if we choose to do that, we're going to have bad outcomes. That's almost a guarantee. And so asking someone to run their facility under a 202C exception where they're going to be sued by some ENGO in the future, people are not going to sign up for litigation. They're going to say, I'm not going to do that. And then you're going to get into the struggle of, well, you're being ordered to do it. Well, are you going to pay the fine when it comes out? The answer is usually no. So there's a lot at play here, and having people hear and understand the information and incorporate it into future rules has been a struggle.
Okay, so not everyone probably is familiar with the federal rules. So basically, they're either requiring carbon capture and storage
Correct.
by a certain date, or you have to shut down a coal-fired power plant. And I think what I hear you saying is the reliability hasn't quite been taken into account. The other thing that I personally have voiced a few times is that even those of us working on carbon capture and storage who have been a long time, and Wyoming's way ahead of the game, we could add this technology to our plants. But the number of vendors that are offering capture technologies, the pipeline that would need to be built, these are all things that we feel confident we can do here in Wyoming. You couldn't meet the deadlines for more than a few plants. And now we're fully committed to doing the research and technology development to bring down costs, to have more vendors, quite frankly. You need more technologies, more vendors. So we're fully committed, but the timelines aren't realistic. But at the same time, it's really hard to build new power plants, even wind and solar. Like wind, it isn't a drop-in replacement for, you can't take a coal plant offline, build a wind plant and say, well, we've created
it's not one for one.
No, it's not one for one. And in addition, wind facilities may need electric transmission to get to the markets. They can't always plug in right where the coal plant shut down.
Yep.
Actually, most of the time you can. I think a lot of those, what you would call low-hanging fruit, those opportunities have been taken.
Correct.
So for example, we have one of the largest onshore, I think it is the largest onshore wind facility being developed here in Wyoming, and they're 17 years in now. And part of that does have to do with the large scale transmission, but these are real problems. And the other part has to do with it's on federal lands. So it is a slow process. And so it is concerning. Sorry, just hopped up on my soapbox there.
It's okay. I'm going to do it myself.
But I do think, Wyoming has everything it needs in terms of geology, in terms of the right regulatory framework, in terms of expertise and experience. We have an existing CO2 pipelines. We have an existing enhanced oil recovery experience in the state. We have everything we need, and still not sure we could meet that deadline just here.
Yeah.
But as you said, it's not only about Wyoming. So we're serving electricity to other markets. We're selling coal to these markets, and those plants that you're talking about that could shut down consume Wyoming coal. So, and that includes PJM. So first of all, for those who aren't familiar, what is the PJM market? Where is it?
Great question. PJM is the largest organized market in the United States. It's 13 states in the District of Columbia. It basically spans from Illinois to the Atlantic Ocean, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, down to parts of North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Delaware. I'm going to miss a state somewhere in there, but those 13 states and 65 million customers are within the footprint of that RTO, or that regional transmission organization. So, and that peak load in PJM, I think the last year when they procured was about 186,000 megawatts.
That's big.
It's the largest market.
Not megawatts. Do you say
186,000?
1,000.
Yeah,
I
megawatts.
forgot about the zeros. Yeah.
It's the largest
That's
market
big.
in the U.S.
Wow. So talk a little bit about how PJM works, and more specifically, any issues. We've talked a lot about reliability. Anything else that PJM and others are facing?
How much time do we have?
Okay. Pick the big ones.
The PJM market's really based on three things. There's an energy market, there's a capacity market, and there's ancillary services. And each of them are procured to ensure that there is sufficient reliable power that can be dispatched when it's needed. Back to our discussion about the reserve margin. How do you procure enough in order to achieve both your peak demand and then that reserve margin? So they do a lot of that. The challenge PJM's been experiencing now for several years is states' utilities joined the RTO. It was all about least cost dispatch. That's why you joined. You wanted to get into the market. They would dispatch your resources. You would find yourself in a better economic position than you would be otherwise. Made a lot of sense. Well, state policies have changed substantially since 2005. And now you have kind of the red state, blue state problem. I hate to classify it that way, but that's really kind of how it is, where some states have decided that they want to be very progressive in their environmental policy and they want to shut down certain resources. Other states have said we're very comfortable with the fleet that we have and we want to continue to operate them. And the stress on the market operator to say, well, I need you to accommodate my requests. We don't really care what the other states want. So you've got states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia that are still comfortable building natural gas-fired generation. You've got states like New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, some others that are like, we don't want anything to do with fossil or gas. We're trying to get it off the system as fast as we can. They're all in one unhappy family at the moment, trying to figure out how they're supposed to navigate through the evolution of the market to accommodate the changing perspectives. So it was easy when we all wanted least cost. Everybody, that's an easy problem to solve. Even this non-math person could do it. But now that you've got to juggle 13 state policies and then try to ensure that that outcome still delivers reliable, affordable power, it starts to challenge the fundamentals of how the market has been designed and what do you need to do in order to correct that. And even as we're recording, there's further delay to the next auction that's already behind as PJM is trying to adjust the rules to the market to ensure that it complies with all of the expectations and obligations of the stakeholders, the states, and the various parties to the market itself. And so it's going through some growing pains at the moment, and we hope it comes out in a good spot in the future. But this is yet another delay in an auction that's supposed to be 3 years forward looking so that you know you're basically procuring resources for 3 years from now. We're basically procuring resources for 1 year ahead. We're so far behind on the auctions. And so we've got to get that resolved. And so hopefully by June, that will be corrected. But that's how it works, and that's what some of the challenges are today.
You know, everybody has the same problems. Sounds like some of the challenges that even the rural electric cooperatives are facing, because not everyone wants the same thing. But it's interesting that you think that not everyone can agree that like reliability should be like the fundamental number one, and cost maybe number one and number two.
Yeah. All the polling that we've done, and we've done a bunch, says that those, like it polls at like 95, 97%. People want reliability first and they want affordability second. And we still can't figure out who the 3% are. I'm just not sure if they didn't hear the question, like who doesn't want reliable power? The rubber meets the road when you have to pay the bill.
Yeah.
And then how do you actually achieve that? Because people have been sold a bill of goods in a lot of ways that say, we can do this, it'll be cheap, and we're going to be able to do it by X date, and this is the resources that we'll use. Well, it turns out, A, it's not that fast, it's not that cheap, and it can't be done in the timeline that you've been told. And oh, by the way, even in a high renewables penetration environment, every credible study that's been done has said you're going to need coal and natural gas, more natural gas than coal, but some coal will stay on the system for at least till 2050. But people are being told we're going to be at zero emission, all renewables by now. And that's just not the reality. And so people's thinking is going to have to change to reflect what the reality on the system is, as opposed to what they hope it will be. That's that aspirational versus reality-based thinking, that gap is growing, it's not shrinking.
I think, the U.S. generally has incredibly high reliability compared to the rest of the world. And maybe we've taken it for granted a bit. And those who don't follow this, maybe we'll start paying attention. We'll see. But so bringing it back to Wyoming, the School of Energy Resources, we're really focused on advancing energy-driven economic development, which means, using Wyoming's incredible energy resources to drive incremental revenue for the state. Is there anything specific that you think institutions, and specifically research institutions like the School of Energy Resources, should be doing to help our energy industry, given your experience, and I guess particularly in the electric grid and transmission system, but we'll take anything.
Yeah, I think you're doing a lot of it right now. I mean, my experience in getting to tour some of the facilities and the test projects that are underway in the state they're terrific for a number of reasons. One of which, they're trying to solve the problem that policymakers say they want to solve. It'll solve it here, but it's replicable in other jurisdictions. So if you crack the nut and figure out the cost-effective way to do carbon capture and sequestration, and that can then be transferred to other jurisdictions where policymakers insist that that's going to be the order of the day, or that will help comply with future EPA rules that say that that's the technology that's going to have to be used, that innovation will be deployed by not just our members, but certainly our members, but the utilities, the co-ops, public power. That's good for you in state, but that's also good for technology transfers that you can share with others. I mean, I think if you're either manufacturing it, you're licensing it, you're selling it to third parties who are then going to pay people in Wyoming for the homework that you've done in order to solve the problem, that's critically important, because I don't think we're going to top-down government mandate our way to solutions. We're going to innovate our way to solutions. And you all are spending a lot of time and effort working on innovating solutions that will deliver the outcomes people say they want. That's the kind of thinking that's going to help get us across the what do they call it? The valley of death
Yeah.
between,
Yep.
a good idea in the lab and commercialization. You're actually doing those things. And that's encouraging because you don't always see people investing in that. You see people talk about it, but seeing people put the time and the money and the effort into trying to actually deliver the solutions is going to be fundamentally important, both for your objectives here, but how that can be replicated in other jurisdictions.
That's a great point. And I think when it comes to energy innovation, that's exactly right. There's a valley of death. I think Wyoming is the best place to innovate and demonstrate novel energy technologies for so many reasons we talk about all the time on the podcast, because we have this incredible public that is very energy savvy, is very open to different technologies. When we do polls of Wyomingites, whether they're in energy communities or not, we really see there's a lot of support for energy, different technologies. There's very little opposition. And when the support is lower, it's usually more, I'm neutral or I want to learn more.
Okay.
And then we have, of course, the geology, all kinds of different things. And we have a great regulatory framework. We're able to work with the governor's office and the legislature to get laws in place or support in place to move forward innovative projects. And so, here at the School of Energy Resources, we really like, and across the University of Wyoming, we like to work on innovation. And that can really bring down costs. The other thing that can bring down costs, though, is that first demonstrations. And that's why Wyoming can kind of take its future in its own hands. If we can demonstrate technologies here, that actually is one of the greatest things you can do to lower costs. So if you're, let's say, looking at a new carbon capture technology, getting that built at a meaningful scale, like we're doing at the Integrated Test Center, that makes a difference, because whether it's energy technology or other technologies, generally there's this phenomenon called learning by doing.
Yep.
I guess it's not just energy technologies. That happens with basically everything in life, but it's probably the most impactful way to reduce costs. And then the other thing is just economies of scale. So if we can get the ball rolling and an energy technology provider is building one system, then 3, then 5, all of a sudden those costs come down because they're not doing, everything's not one off.
Yep.
Their facilities or manufacturing facilities are operating. So it really is a great opportunity in the state. And I appreciate that you recognize that. So, and you're here at the University of Wyoming. We haven't talked about it much, but of course, one of our greatest responsibilities is to train the next generation of energy professionals. We do that here at the School of Energy Resources, but also many other units across the university. What would you say to students looking at the energy sector about different areas of interest, what you can go into? What would you say?
Yeah, it was funny. I got a report this morning that said we are, in effect, and I think it was IEA that put out the paper, but said we're in the age of electricity. So energy is going to be even more important than it's been in the past. Historically, it's always been important. You watch every iteration of how society advances. There's no wealthy society that doesn't have energy at the core of how they do it, and it's got to be affordable energy to help you do that. If students today are interested in figuring out how to advance artificial intelligence or data centers or crypto mining or electric vehicles or whatever other innovative technologies we haven't even thought of yet, power is going to be how we get there from here. And it's the entire value chain. It's not just the electric power plant. It's what's the input to the electric power plant, whether it's coal, it's nuclear, it's gas, it's battery storage, whatever it is. You're the one that's helping to enable those technologies to happen. There's a former utility CEO that used to say that electricity is 7% of the U.S. economy, but it's the first 7%, because without that first 7%, none of the rest of this works. And I think that's critically important. And I think if you want to work in an industry that's evolving and changing at a pace that's faster than it has probably in the last 30 years, energy is it. If you're looking at a sector of the economy that is vitally important to where we are going, not just where we are, energy is it, whether it's production or it's distribution, transfer. I mean, we're going to look at a completely different world 30 years from now, and energy is going to be the key to how we get from here to there. That seems like a pretty exciting place to get to. And it doesn't all have to be people who are doing the deep thinking on things that I'm not smart enough to figure out. I mean, we're going to need people all through the entire energy value chain. So if you want to be outside and you want to work in the field, whether it's in a mine or at a gas and oil production facility, or you want to work in a control room that's operating a nuclear facility, or you want to think about being an economist to figure out how you're going to make these markets work in a way that's more efficient and more effective, the opportunities are essentially endless, because we're all trying to figure out how to do it smarter, faster, better, cheaper. And new ideas and new people coming in that approach the problem differently, I think are going to be critical for us to solve some of these problems going forward. So if you want an opportunity to be really plugged in and have the opportunity to make real positive change, energy is kind of where it's at.
And it impacts everything.
Every single thing.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So thank you so much for being here. This has been an incredible conversation. You're not done though. So for our last questions, I'm going to give you a choice. We always ask our guests to tell us either their favorite place to visit in Wyoming. You've only been here a short time, so I'm going to give you another option. It's up to you. Or something you'd like our listeners to know about you. Your choice.
I think I would say that I have enjoyed the eastern quarter of Wyoming because that's what I've been to. But I am fascinated by, just in my brief time to be in the state, to see the vast variety of both technology, landscape. I mean, your resources are, you can read it in a book, but when you actually walk out here and look and see, okay, there's where we do this mining. There's where we do this oil and gas production. Here's where the rail cars are that are moving all of this commodity. Over here is where we're doing some of the other energy production. And by this thing that you might not have paid attention to, that's where we're trying to develop really innovative technologies to help advance us into the future so we can continue to do what we do. That's pretty cool. And you don't see that in a lot of jurisdictions. And I think the focus that the school is taking and the various people that you're working with and who are your partners could not be more enthusiastic about what they're doing. And that's how we're going to solve these problems. And so I'm encouraged that there are people in places that if you've never been to the center of the country and you just have read about it in a book and you come out and you talk to these people and you look them in the eye and understand that they're passionate about solving the problems and they actually want to get things done, those are the people that are going to make the rest of this take care of itself. So I think you've got a wealth of resources here in virtually every community that we have either stopped, visited, been in, driven through. It's the same kind of like, let's just get it done, how to solve it kind of perspective. I think that's incredibly valuable.
Well, you've certainly tapped into that Wyoming spirit during your time here.
I'm a quick study, I think.
Well, Todd, thank you so much for coming and visiting us here at the School of Energy Resources and for doing this podcast.
Thanks, Holly. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. We will be taking a short break for the holidays, but we'll be back with a new episode on January 8th. See you then.